Large imposing castles, shadows as far as the eye can see, looming dread, timeless romance, more looming dread. These are but a few hallmarks of Gothic horror, one of Hollywood's most lush and alluring traditions. While films like Crimson Peak, A Cure for Wellness, and Suspiria have received a large industry push in recent years, this is a genre with roots in a bygone era. Francis Ford Coppola's wildly underrated Dracula, Hitchcock's Rebecca, J.A. Bayona's The Orphanage, and other films of this ilk are grand, stately imposing, classically minded in their aesthetics. For these reasons, they're quite expensive to produce, and given this particularly risk-averse period of Hollywood that we're living through, you couldn't be blamed for thinking that a big-budget remake of the classic horror tale Nosferatu would not be released by a prominent Hollywood studio. But you would be wrong, and thank God. Though with the sinister evils of Nosferatu, God's got nothing to do with it. The last decade has been good to horror. Filmmakers like Ari Aster, Jennifer Kent, Jordan Peele, and Zach Cregger have each left their own indelible mark on a genre that had for years been relegated to spaces either overly commercial or distinctly schlocky, but rarely in the sweet spot for a true genre auteur. There is one name, however, that I believe to be elevated above nearly all of his peers, and that is Robert Eggers, the goddamn Eggman. Oh, I love this guy so fucking much. You probably remember when I did a video on The Northman and I talked about how that film was a masterpiece. Well, this man is seemingly incapable of making anything other than a masterpiece, because that's exactly what Nosferatu is, and we're gonna get into that. Eggers emerged seemingly organically when his film The Witch premiered at Sundance in 2015. This was before A24 had become the hereditary horror factory, and they were still looking for targeting acquisitions to lay the groundwork for the massive media brand that they would become in the years to follow. When The Witch landed in Park City, Utah, that snowy January, it did not have a distributor home. All that preceded it was some hushed word of mouth suggesting that this one would be a title to watch at the festival. Then it premiered, and holy shit, the reviews out of Sundance spoke of a deeply terrifying meditation on America's colonial origins with imagery so shocking they couldn't believe it would find a traditional distributor home. These sorts of hyperbolic festival reactions have become A24's stock in trade, a relatively standard element of their marketing machine, but in 2015, this was an organic and shared conclusion held by many festival attendees. And they were right. Like, The Witch is probably, to this day, one of the scariest films I've ever watched. And not like, oh my god, it's so scary, like I can't look at what's going on screen, but like the kind of scary that lingers with you, the kind of thing that kept me up at night because I kept thinking about the atmosphere, the voices, the sound, the fucked up shit that Robert Eggers put on screen that somehow got under your skin and didn't leave. A truly creepy bastard of horror had emerged, and we all couldn't wait to see what he would do next. Now, it's not that The Witch was the first of its kind. There's obviously a precedent for sophisticated, elevated horror, particularly in the European tradition with filmmakers like Nicholas Roeg, but it was the fact that the work was by an unknown American director who exploded onto the Sundance scene as if shot from a cannon. His approach to writing made his projects very distinct because he would start with primary sources, historical documents, and reverse engineer a script from period linguistics sourced from diaries, periodicals, and other sources. To put it plainly, the guy's a fucking dork. He's a big history nerd, and I think that's what makes his film so goddamn awesome. The Witch tells the story of a God-fearing family in the early days of white colonists on the American continent who would come to learn there were far more immediate and terrifying things to worry about. Eggers pulled from folklore and first-hand accounts of fears held by settlers in this period and rendered them a reality on screen. It makes for horror that is particularly striking in its grounded realism, despite featuring witches who lubricate their brooms with the blood of children. He would take this approach next to his Lovecraftian horror comedy The Lighthouse and his Norse epic The Northman. But what happens when a filmmaker with a very specific process and commitment to verisimilitude within genre pivots to a beloved story that has already been adapted? Well, I can't speak generally, but in this case, I can tell you that he blows them all out of the fucking water. There's no reason to tiptoe around it anymore, so I'm going to lead with the most important thing you need to know. Nosferatu is, with very little close competition, my favorite film of the year. period. It is a film shockingly alive and confrontational, while still managing to respect its silent film forebears with its emphasis on atmosphere and the unspoken over-endless plot machinations. It inverts the gender power dynamics in unexpected ways, turning a classic Gothic tale into one of unexpected empowerment. It is, to keep things on theme, a rush of hot new blood directly into my veins. It is a masterpiece. And without further ado, I just want to gush about it, man. Like, this film fucking rules. Like a punctured artery of one of Count Orlock's victims. Let's get into it. Before we get into the weeds, let's touch on the key points one should know about Nosferatu before diving into the latest adaptation. Nosferatu was born as a German expressionist film in the 1920s that was a near clone of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Save for a few key differences, the shared story DNA is almost complete. It tells the story of a young married man who receives a strange career opportunity in the form of an offer to visit a reclusive old count at his distant castle to broker a real estate deal. While this initially seems like a bout of good fortune, he eventually learns that this count is, you guessed it, a vampire, and he is desperately in love with his wife. Okay, that's all you really need to know, as the film is largely characterized by its atmosphere and an iconic performance from Max Schreck. Now, let's fast forward 100 years. Nosferatu is the film that Robert Eggers has wanted to make his entire life. Not merely his entire film career, but since he was a kid. Ever since he put on a stage production of Nosferatu in high school, he has been obsessed with this primordial horror tale that ostensibly gave birth to his greatest influences as a director. After refining his craft with The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman, he struck while the iron was hot and made what is, for my money, the greatest Dracula adaptation ever. And while the Coppola Dracula film was always my favorite Dracula film until this, I've always said that 1958's The Horror of Dracula, starring Christopher Lee, is the best Dracula film. Hammer Films may have been better equipped to capture the pure and distilled vampire story, but Coppola turned that shit up to 11 with a visual feast, a fucking fever dream matched only by its Gary Oldman performance. But you know what, I digress. I've got a video about that. I've actually got a video on the Christopher Lee Dracula film as well you should check out. I fucking love Dracula. I think that's really what I'm getting at here. So to say that Nosferatu is the best quote-unquote Dracula film ever made, I think kind of speaks volumes, considering I have a lot of reverence for the past adaptations. Nosferatu manages to bleed both for inspiration, combining the best elements of Coppola's film, which endeavors to more closely adapt Stoker's prose, hence Bram Stoker's Dracula, while Hammer was more interested in an animalistic take on the character that would mint a horror icon. In Nosferatu, Orlock, in his own words, is appetite. Pure and simple. In this elemental way, Eggers figures Orlock in his most distilled essence, a figure at a nexus of desire and anguish, violence and sexuality. In reducing the character to its purest form, he gets at the Hammer vision of Dracula while unable to abandon his own literary approach. From an aesthetic standpoint, Nosferatu is unimpeachable, to say the least. The film opens with a roar of sound design that nearly knocked me out of my fucking chair.
Nosferatu.
And it doesn't let up from the beginning. Eggers uses a combination of extreme contrasting sounds and inky black shadow to give form to the titular Nosferatu before we ever see his face. This movie has such a distinct and evil energy to it that, rather than attempt to describe it to you, I'll just ask you a quick question. Why have you not seen this film yet? Go see it! Orlock represents humanity's most carnal desires, which is why there's a sort of sexuality to the way he feeds. And I don't mean that in a seductive way. It's not a sexy movie. The way this vampire straddles and gulps atop his victims is rather unnerving in that it feels both familiar and new all at once. Pure instinct, it's feeding, it's animalistic. There's more going on underneath the surface with Orlock than there is Christopher Lee's Dracula. He yearns to prove his commitment to a woman who continues to push him away because he clearly can't allow his ego to see the truth. Herr Canuck offers himself up willingly, but that doesn't really interest Orlock. He needs to experience the thrill of the pursuit, and that makes him more like Bram Stoker's Dracula. He desires something, he covets something that he can't simply have. Eggers is actually on the record as being both a fan of the Hammer classics and the more recent Coppola adaptation. Not surprising, as I've said, the guy's a huge fucking dork, and that rules. I am too. But the thing that I could not have anticipated was how well he would merge these influences while still carving out an identity entirely his own. As I mentioned previously, Robert Eggers has an uncanny knack for marrying naturalism with genre iconography without ever diluting either ingredient in the stew, in the which you are equally convinced that this is a family of settlers that could well have existed in American history, while also having no trouble situating a very real coven of witches in that world. Even when the lighthouse offered up its Cthulhuoid tentacles, the farting seaman kept its feet planted firmly on the ground, and in the Northman, even for its unicorns and lush mysticism, the visceral thrills and knuckle-crunching action kept things rooted in a believable European history. Now, with the well-known story of Nosferatu, Eggers has a new challenge, grounding an iconic work of fiction in a world that feels both real and heightened at once. And he nails it. One of the greatest tools in his kit this time around to keep the movie within the realm of the real is the strength of his actors. First up is Lily-Rose Depp, who is wonderful and finally given the opportunity to carry a truly great work on her shoulders. Like, I think people are going to walk away from this thing being genuinely shocked at what Lily-Rose Depp proves she is capable of. She's kind of had an albatross around her neck for the last year or so after The Idol, HBO's failed successor to Euphoria, but that show's masturbatory misfire was not remotely her fault. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that she gives a genuinely great performance in that show. Here, she has the opportunity to disappear into the role of Ellen Hutter, the wife of real estate agent Thomas and doomed muse of Count Orlock. Despite the heightened circumstances of being pseudo-star-crossed lovers with a vampire, she grounds the film in an authentic, lived experience. Her patience, then her pain, and her eventual resolve and sacrifice make some of the most impressive acting you'll see this year. Her accent and demure period performance are transformative and striking.
The stench of their bodies was horrible.
Immediately pulling the audience into her world. I could gush about her performance all day, and I'm sure I'll continue to in the various forms that I talk about movies on the internet, but if you want a bit more insight into her process, you can check out my recent interview with her right here. All of that to say, Lily-Rose Depp gives my favorite performance of the year. The way she's able to portray the dichotomy of depression and desire. This is such a complex character that I think is further texturized by Lily-Rose Depp's performance, and I think we're witnessing the birth of a genuine star here with her. Opposite Depp is the always brilliant Nicholas Holt, who's having a banner year with this, Juror Number 2, and The Order. His cool everyman is the perfect audience stand-in for the insanity of this world. We believe in his earnest aspiration to buy a home for his wife and build a family, but it's apparent from the start that he is, well, fucked. With Thomas as a focal point, this is a story of innocence lost. He thinks the world is as straightforward as getting a job so he can provide for his wife and be a bonafide man, but the dark reality of his situation quickly dismantles his every naive notion. From the start, it's clear that his wife Ellen is dealing with a material darkness that is disrupting her everyday life, but Thomas is both unwilling and incapable of seeing this. From his perspective, any darkness is something that will pass after a season or when all of life's essential pieces fall into place. When the opportunity arises for Thomas to travel to see the Count so he can close the big real estate deal, Ellen implores him to stay, but he goes anyway. From his perspective, he is doing what a husband should do for his wife, when in reality, he's ignoring the words coming from her mouth. This creates an interesting inversion that turns Thomas into a sort of damsel in distress, while Ellen's greater awareness of the situation and agency shift their power dynamic in an unexpected way. By rooting the film in Ellen's perspective, it grants the story a level of psychological complexity and modernity that was not possible in the 1922 original. In short, Eggers grants Nosferatu a whole new dimensionality. Ellen is characterized by an intense loneliness and intrusive sexuality that creates a gulf of language between her and Thomas. The things she yearns for are so culturally unacceptable as to be considered abject, which creates a figurative space to be occupied by something monstrous in Count Orlock. Because she is unable to give voice to her feelings, they take on a sort of corporeal form in the omnipresent vampire's dread. Through her friend, Anna, she sees what it's like for a woman to compartmentalize her desires, and she can't allow herself to live a life like that, and so she keeps her secret.
Alright then, keep your secrets.
The yearning she sent out into the universe that was answered by Count Orlock in a way that was at first thrilling and sensual, but eventually gave way to fear. And so she is now bound to Orlock, a bond unbroken by great distances, represented in the film by an intense feeling of omnipresent dread. This is Ellen's punishment. In the words of Robert Eggers himself, particularly in the 1980s, there was a lot of literary criticism talking about all these Victorian male authors who created these female heroines who have sexual desire and sexual energy and then need to be killed and punished for it. It's this misogynist thing. But I think a lot of female literary critics who I was also reading were saying, but isn't it also interesting that from this repressed cultural period, there's the idea of this dark, tonic female heroine who would be the person who could understand the depths. And in telling that same kind of story in a modern context, even trying to stay through the lens of the 19th century, we could have potentially some more nuance there, potentially, hopefully. Ellen stands as a general representation of the inherent friction between a woman's desires and the patriarchal structures to which she is subject. Within Nosferatu, Eggers makes it his mission to redirect the agency in the story to the female subject so often shortchanged in these stories. And while Ellen is undoubtedly a victim, the dynamic between she and Orlock is much more complicated than that. As I mentioned earlier, Orlock haunts Ellen in a profound way, and the arc of their relationship has left her in a very dark place, but there's no denying that he satisfies an excitement and an eroticism that she can't find anywhere else. Because Thomas can never truly understand her needs, and Orlock understands her only in these terms, in her essential lack, he represents this incredibly charged aspect of her love life that can't be satisfied within her present domestic life, no matter how much money Thomas makes or how large a house he manages to buy. There's a moment where you feel like, because of what Thomas endured at Orlock's castle, that he will finally be able to connect with Ellen in a way that will bridge their disconnect, but when the time comes, he's rendered mute himself. The presence of Orlock represents all of the unspeakable things and feelings within a chaste society, and rather than bring this couple closer together, his experience at the castle only further solidifies the brick wall that separates them. There's something that exists within Ellen and Orlock that they desire and can't get anywhere. A deep passion and understanding. Thomas tries to remain pure and aligned with the values society has prefigured for the male head of a household, but this begins to unravel when Ellen says,
He'd never please me as he could.
Ellen has previously made reference to this dark specter, even going so far as to say that she dreamt of being with death and felt a happiness unlike anything else. But prior to this, Thomas never really took her seriously. He always dismissed these moments as depressive outbursts rather than statements with material cause. But at this point, everything has changed. He's never let the darkness in, and I think deep down, he knows that what Ellen is saying is true, and it almost spurs him to prove her, if only for a moment, wrong. This is one of many scenes in the film wherein Eggers plays with dual meanings, and this confrontation is really their culmination. At first, it's very straightforward, very much exactly what Ellen is saying, and then there's a turn in the scene when Ellen is possessed, where the dialogue takes on new meaning, and Thomas is almost hearing exactly what he thinks Ellen is saying. The one other character I'd be remiss not to discuss is Vonfron, wonderfully portrayed by Willem Dafoe. He's critical to understanding the POV of Nosferatu because he represents a different kind of outsider. Despite his education and proven intellect, he was dismissed and written off for embracing a non-conformist, free-thinking mentality. While he is at odds with the conventional way of thinking, he bears a more intuitive and open relationship to the world, which allows him to see and hear Ellen in the way she wants and needs to be heard, as a friend. Even her husband's closest acquaintances are quick to bind and medicate her when she begins to manifest the imminent arrival of Orlock, but Franz sees the truth of the matter instantly. Science is objective fact, but its meaning must be interpreted, and we must use our instincts and feelings in order to do so. That's what Vonfron does so well. He's not simply a science denier, far from it. He understands that the truth of life is somewhere between hard science and raw feeling. He's a good doctor because he listens to his patient instead of arriving at a stock conclusion that rejects their lived experience. And boy, is she having some experiences. Now, as a quick aside, there's a character you'll notice I'm avoiding meaningful discussion on a level of performance, and that is Orlock. I don't want to demystify or spoil what Bill Skarsgård is doing here because it's truly terrific. More than that, it's that he disappears completely into the role. I mean, he becomes the darkness, and when you're watching him, you just feel like you're watching Nosferatu, or at least a hybrid of the classic Orlock and like Rasputin's mustache. But regardless, Bill Skarsgård is just doing stuff in this film that is chilling on every level. The voice, first and foremost, is indescribable.
It is a black omen to journey in poor health.
The fact that that's actually him, that he trained his voice to go that low, is beyond insanity. I mean, it's a level of commitment you have to admire, and it makes the character all the more scary. But even more than that, I think what Eggers and Skarsgård really get in this interpretation of the classic vampire is the undead nature of a vampire. Seeing Orlock as this husk of a man that is purely surviving on his animal instincts alone, I mean, it creates this very chilling character. His obsessiveness, the way he demands his dominance, I mean, it's clear that there's a power dynamic at play here, that there is something that he needs to be in control of, and Ellen represents something that he is not in control of. And so we have this domineering force that is Orlock and the submissives that he takes from it. This is definitely playing with power dynamics in a way that I don't think we've seen in an adaptation of Dracula or Nosferatu before. Nosferatu goes to great lengths to align the looming shadow of Orlock with the secrets and darkness that all of the characters harbor. If we are first to tame the darkness, we must first acknowledge that it exists, says Willem Dafoe's Vonfron. All of this comes to a head when Ellen acknowledges that she needs to sacrifice herself to defeat Orlock once and for all. Thomas thinks he's the hero positioned to defeat this vampire once and for all, but he's ultimately made a fool. Because of his experience with Orlock, he mistakenly believes that he understands Ellen, understands the nature of evil and what must be done to defeat him. But what he fails to see is that he is merely a distraction. While Ellen is, again, a victim, she is empowered to choose her own fate after being made to feel powerless and ignored, drugged and bound to a bed to curb her hysteria. And while there is a tragedy in her death, her final moments with Orlock are strangely tender and even heartbreaking. The shot of Orlock's face crying tears of blood before the sun spells his ultimate end was profoundly moving and, dare I say, sad. I mean, Orlock is the big bad, but he's also a being of desire and, however fucked up it may seem, love for Ellen. And Ellen, after being failed by those around her and dismissed as a hysterical woman, finally gets to make a choice. She reclaims her agency. She is in control at that very moment. She gets to die and take her specter with her on her own terms. As much as Nosferatu is a triumph of character-driven storytelling, it is also perhaps unexpectedly a mirror for our world. When Orlock arrives back in the city, he brings with him a horrific plague that leaves bodies strewn about the streets and generates a critical level of confusion. Through the hysteria and misinformation, it's not hard to draw parallels to COVID and our recent history, though what is even more interesting is that what it seems to say about women and the way our society treats victims. For years, Ellen has been struggling with a darkness that she could not articulate properly to anyone. She was treated like she was crazy, with her experience explained away by various unrelated explanations, until the darkness comes to town and everybody is suddenly consumed by this dread, frantically looking for answers. They could not possibly understand or empathize with her plight until it arrived at their doorstep. And even then, I mean, they really struggle to grapple with what they're being confronted with, and you can see how it undoes people like Aaron Taylor Johnson's character. Nosferatu is ultimately a film about the dangers of ignoring the deepest, strangest truths of ourselves, what we're drawn to, what attracts us, even though we know it may be bad, even dangerous. It's about learning to make peace with the taboos that lurk in the shadows before they give shape to themselves and manifest in unhealthy ways. But I'm probably making it sound a little more serious than it is. Like, it's a heady film, it's very intellectual, and I think it poses a lot of interesting ideas about humanity, death, and the world around us, but look, Nosferatu's also funny, it's sexy, it's scary, like really scary, and one of the scariest films I think I've seen in a very long time, and I think it's proof that Robert Eggers is one of the best filmmakers we have, and now that he's conquered his dream project, the sky is the limit. The sky, where bats fly. There's bats up there, you know? Yeah, sorry, just trying to loop it back around and make it, you get the point.